Most defendants enter a courtroom with fear in their eyes. 19-year-old Caleb Sterling entered with a smirk. From the moment he sat down at the defense table, it was obvious he didn't take any of this seriously. While reporters filled the gallery and the victim's family sat silently in the front row, Caleb leaned back in his chair, whispering jokes to his attorney and occasionally glancing at his reflection in his phone screen. To him, this wasn't a criminal trial. It was an inconvenience. After all, Caleb had spent his entire life protected by wealth. His father owned one of the largest construction companies in the state, and his mother was a well-known corporate attorney. Every mistake he'd ever made had disappeared behind expensive lawyers, private settlements, and carefully written checks. Why should this time be any different? Across the courtroom sat 72-year-old Walter Briggs, a retired firefighter who had spent decades serving his community. Months earlier, Walter's life had changed forever after a brutal attack outside his home left him permanently dependent on assisted care. The prosecution claimed Caleb was responsible. The defense insisted it was a misunderstanding. Caleb seemed completely unconcerned either way. As the charges were read, he actually smiled. Judge Rebecca Hart noticed immediately. She had spent nearly 30 years on the bench and recognized arrogance, the same way a sailor recognizes an approaching storm. What troubled her wasn't Caleb's confidence. It was how rehearsed it seemed, as if he already knew he would walk free. Then the prosecutor revealed something unexpected. Investigators had recently recovered evidence from a source nobody had anticipated. Evidence that had been hidden for nearly 6 months. For the first time, Caleb's attorney stopped smiling. And for the first time that morning, Caleb looked genuinely nervous. Because whatever investigators had found wasn't part of the defense strategy, and it had the potential to destroy everything. A former friend of Caleb's walks into the courtroom carrying a forgotten backup drive, one containing a recording Caleb believed had been erased forever. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor called the next witness. A young man in a gray suit walked slowly toward the stand. Caleb's expression changed instantly. For the first time since the trial began, his confidence cracked. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said. "Tyler Monroe." A murmur spread through the gallery. Tyler had once been one of Caleb's closest friends. They attended the same private academy, played on the same sports teams, and spent years in the same social circle. Now he was testifying against him. Caleb leaned forward. "What is he doing here?" he whispered frantically to his attorney. The lawyer didn't answer because he didn't know either. Tyler took the oath and sat down. The prosecutor placed a small black flash drive on the evidence table. "Mr. Monroe, do you recognize this item?" "Yes." "What is it?" Tyler swallowed hard. "It's a backup drive." The prosecutor nodded. "And why is it important?" Tyler looked directly at Caleb. "Because Caleb gave it to me." The room became completely still. Months before Walter Briggs was attacked, Caleb and several friends had created a private online group where they shared videos, messages, and recordings they didn't want anyone else seeing. According to Tyler, Caleb believed everything inside the group disappeared automatically. But Tyler had quietly saved copies, including one particular audio recording, a recording Caleb thought had vanished forever. The prosecutor connected a laptop to the courtroom speakers. Caleb immediately stood. "No." His voice was barely audible. The judge looked up sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling." Caleb slowly lowered himself back into his chair. His face had turned pale. The audio began to play. At first, there was only laughter. Then Caleb's voice became clear. "I found the perfect target." The courtroom froze. More laughter followed, then another sentence, one that made Walter Briggs' family begin to cry. "Nobody's going to care about some old guy living alone." The recording ended. Silence, Daffelitzel's silence. Judge Hart stared at Caleb. The smirk was gone. The confidence was gone. For the first time, the jury wasn't looking at a misunderstood teenager. They were looking at someone who had planned everything, and the worst evidence hadn't even been played yet because Tyler had brought a second recording, one made after the attack, and it would shock the entire courtroom. The second recording captures Caleb bragging about the attack and reveals a detail investigators had never publicly disclosed. The tension inside the courtroom was unbearable. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Even Caleb's attorney looked worried now. The prosecutor held up another flash drive. Mr. Monroe, is this the second recording you provided to investigators? Yes, and when was it made? The night after Walter Briggs was attacked. A murmur swept through the gallery. Judge Hart signaled for silence. The prosecutor pressed play. The audio crackled through the speakers. Several young voices could be heard laughing in the background. Then Caleb's voice emerged, clear, confident, proud. At first, the conversation sounded harmless. Then everything changed. I told you he'd go down. More laughter. Someone asked if the old man had fought back. Caleb chuckled. Not a chance. The jury listened carefully. Then came the statement that changed the entire trial. He hit the mailbox harder than I expected. The prosecutor immediately stopped the recording. Silence filled the room. Several jurors exchanged looks. Judge Hart leaned forward. So the defendant knew about the mailbox? The prosecutor nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The significance was enormous. Investigators had intentionally withheld that detail from the public. Only the attacker would have known Walter struck a metal mailbox during the assault. The information had never appeared in news reports, never appeared in police statements, never appeared in court filings. Yet Caleb knew. His attorney jumped to his feet. Objection! On what grounds? Judge Hart asked. The attorney hesitated. He didn't have a good answer because the evidence spoke for itself. Across the courtroom, Walter Briggs lowered his head. His hands trembled slightly. For months, he had waited for accountability. Now it was finally beginning to arrive. Meanwhile, Caleb looked completely different from the teenager who had entered court that morning. His face was pale, his hands shook, and for the first time, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. But the prosecution wasn't finished, not even close. The lead detective had discovered something far more damaging than an audio recording, something hidden inside Caleb's own phone records. Something that would prove the attack wasn't spontaneous. It had been planned, and when the jury heard it, any remaining chance of acquittal would disappear forever. Phone records reveal Caleb had been scouting vulnerable targets for weeks, and one text message sent hours before the attack leaves the courtroom in complete shock. By the fourth day of testimony, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had completely changed. When the trial began, Caleb Sterling looked like a confident teenager expecting another easy escape. Now he looked trapped. The prosecution called Detective Marcus Hale to the witness stand. A 20-year veteran investigator, Hale had led the case from the beginning. After taking the oath, he placed a thick folder on the stand. Detective, the prosecutor began, did your investigation uncover evidence from the defendant's phone records? It did. The prosecutor displayed a timeline on the courtroom monitor. Dozens of locations appeared. Dates, times, hours. The jurors leaned forward. What are we looking at? Judge Hart asked. Hale pointed to the screen. Location data recovered from the defendant's phone. The room became quiet. According to the records, Caleb had repeatedly driven through several quiet neighborhoods over a 3-week period before the attack, always late at night, always alone, always slowing near homes occupied by elderly residents. The prosecutor let the information sink in. This wasn't random, was it, Detective? No. Why not? Because the defendant was scouting. A gasp spread through the gallery. Caleb immediately shook his head. No, that's not true. But nobody was listening anymore. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Then the prosecutor displayed a text message sent just hours before Walter Briggs was attacked. The message had been recovered from a cloud backup. The sender was Caleb. The recipient was one of his friends. The courtroom monitor lit up. The message read, "Found another easy one. Old guy, lives alone. Tonight should be entertaining." The room exploded with reactions. Walter's daughter burst into tears. Several jurors stared at Caleb in disbelief. Even his own attorney looked horrified. Judge Hart struck her gavel. "Order!" But the damage was done. The text destroyed the defense's entire argument. This was no accident, no misunderstanding, no momentary lapse in judgment. It was premeditated cruelty. Then something unexpected happened. A movement came from the front row behind the defense table. Caleb's father slowly stood up. The wealthy businessman had remained silent throughout the trial, but the expression on his face told everyone something important. He had just seen the text message for the first time, and what he was about to do would leave the entire courtroom stunned. As Caleb's father rises to speak, everyone expects him to defend his son. Instead, his next words completely destroy the defense and leave Caleb utterly alone. The courtroom was silent as Caleb Sterling's father slowly rose from his seat. Everyone expected outrage. Everyone expected excuses. After all, Victor Sterling had spent years protecting his son from consequences. Whenever trouble appeared, expensive attorneys made it disappear. Whenever complaints surfaced, settlements followed. That was how the Sterling family operated. But today was different. Victor looked exhausted. The confident businessman who had built a multi-million-dollar empire seemed to have aged years over the course of the trial. His eyes remained fixed on the text message displayed on the monitor. "Old guy, lives alone." The words hung in the air like a confession. Victor swallowed hard, then he turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," his voice cracked. The entire courtroom froze. "I've spent this entire trial believing there had to be some explanation." He glanced toward Caleb. "Some misunderstanding." Caleb stared back nervously. "Dad," but Victor continued, "I told myself my son couldn't possibly be the person the prosecution described." A painful silence followed. Then he shook his head. "I was wrong." The gallery erupted into whispers. Caleb's face went pale. His attorney looked stunned. The prosecution remained silent. Victor slowly faced Walter Briggs and his family. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Not a legal statement, not a public relations speech, a genuine apology. Walter's daughter lowered her head and cried. Victor then turned back toward the defense table. For the first time in his life, Caleb looked completely alone. "I spent years protecting you from consequences," Victor said. "I thought I was helping." His eyes filled with disappointment. "But all I really did was teach you that rules didn't apply to you." The words hit harder than any evidence presented during the trial. Caleb looked down at the floor, unable to respond, unable to defend himself. The shield of privilege that had protected him his entire life had finally shattered, and there was nothing left behind. The following morning, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Every person in the courtroom stood. The foreman rose. The verdict was short. Guilty on all counts. A gasp swept through the room. Caleb collapsed into his chair. His future had just changed forever. But Judge Rebecca Hart wasn't finished, because 2 weeks later, at sentencing, she would deliver a message that nobody in that courtroom would ever forget. And by the time her gavel came down, Caleb Sterling would learn a painful truth. Money can buy comfort, power can buy influence, but neither can buy character, and neither can save you when justice finally arrives. At sentencing, Judge Hart delivers a devastating speech about privilege and accountability before handing Caleb a punishment that leaves the courtroom speechless. 2 weeks later, Caleb Sterling stood before Judge Rebecca Hart for sentencing. The difference was impossible to ignore. Gone was the confident teenager who had smirked through testimony and treated the courtroom like a minor inconvenience. Gone were the tailored suits, Gone was the arrogance. Now Caleb stood in a county jail uniform, his shoulders slumped and his eyes fixed on the floor. The courtroom was packed. Rotors lined the back rows. Walter Briggs sat quietly with his family, and for the first time in Caleb's life, there was no wall of protection standing between him and the consequences of his actions. Judge Hart reviewed the file one final time before speaking. In nearly 3 decades on this bench, she began, I have encountered many young defendants who made terrible mistakes. The room was silent. But what separates this case is not simply the crime. She looked directly at Caleb. It is the complete lack of empathy that accompanied it. Caleb swallowed hard. Judge Hart continued. You targeted a vulnerable man because you believed he was easy prey. She paused. You mocked his suffering. Another pause. And you celebrated the harm you caused. Every word landed like a hammer. The judge then turned toward Walter Briggs. Mr. Briggs spent his life serving his community. Her voice softened slightly. Yet, because of one selfish decision, he now faces challenges he never deserved. Several members of Walter's family wiped away tears. Then Judge Hart returned her attention to Caleb. You believed wealth, status, and family influence would protect you. The courtroom remained completely still, but character is revealed when nobody is watching. She picked up the sentencing order, and your character, Mr. Sterling, revealed something deeply troubling. Caleb's hands trembled. The judge's voice became firm. For aggravated assault, robbery, and related charges, this court sentences you to 25 years in state prison. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Caleb closed his eyes. The reality finally hit him. His father lowered his head. Walter Briggs' family embraced one another. Judge Hart struck the gavel. This court is adjourned. The sound echoed through the room. As deputies approached, Caleb didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply stared ahead, understanding that the life he once took for granted was gone. Forever outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to break the story. Inside, Walter Briggs and his family quietly walked toward the exit. Justice couldn't undo the damage. It couldn't restore the years that had been taken from him. But for the first time since that terrible night, they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: peace. And as Caleb Sterling disappeared through the courtroom doors, one lesson remained clear for everyone who witnessed the case. Privilege may delay accountability, but it can never erase it.